Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us for this special Straits Times Roundtable to mark Earth Day. I'm Warren Fernandez, Editor-in-Chief of the Straits Times. Now today we will take up the issue of whether surging energy prices is going to cost us the Earth. We face a triple challenge. Firstly, even while the world continues to grapple with COVID-19, our economies are starting to recover, thereby pushing up demand for energy. Then came the Ukraine war, which caused energy prices to flare up. As governments rushed to secure supplies to keep the lights on and our economies humming, energy security was back on the agenda. Yet, as we all know, today is Earth Day, and we need no reminding that we are facing a climate crisis which needs to be addressed now. So these questions arise. Will rising costs spark a rethink on how and where we get our energy? Will the ongoing war compromise global efforts to tackle the climate crisis? Or does it make the search for greener alternatives even more urgent? Now, to help me answer all these difficult questions, I have an expert panel with me today. Firstly, on my left, Dr. Victor Nian, an advisor from the Center for Strategic and Energy Resources, Swati Mandloi, a youth delegate from Singapore for COP26, and then, of course, our climate change editor for the Straits Times, David Fogarty, and Audrey, our Straits Times environment correspondent. Both David and Audrey helm our Green Pulse podcast, which is popular with the audience, and I hope you've all heard it. And they also cover climate change for the Straits Times. Now, to start with, being Earth Day, I thought we'd focus on solutions to the challenges that we've been talking about. And I wanted to start with Dr. Nian to look at whether the global tensions that we're seeing all around the world, especially with Ukraine, has it made the challenge more difficult, or do you think it will spur us to tackle the issues more aggressively?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and I think it's really most critical for the world to really look at what are the energy options. Fossil prices rising because of the war, because of what is happening with OPEC, and because what is naturally inside the fossil fuel, which is volatility, and now price going up, and naturally you will go to renewables. But what we are seeing today is renewable prices also went up because they're part of the manufacturing business. So now if the countries are thinking ahead, and maybe if you like thinking back and look at whether options like nuclear energy could be a part of the option, whether even hydrogen is a part of the option. So Singapore is thinking about it. And I think what is really happening right now in the world is going to drive that momentum only faster and not going to be slower.
And we've talked about some of the alternatives, nuclear and geothermal and solar. We'll come to that in a minute. But maybe first a question for Swati. As a young person looking at all that's happening, are you more optimistic about our ability to tackle these challenges, or are you getting more and more worried about the future?
Thank you for that question. I think the term we like to use is cautiously optimistic, which is to say we see there is reason for hope. We see an incredible movement in young people and different stakeholders doing advocacy on this topic. So we do see there is so much more to be done, and we see people in action. But the caution comes from the fact that, seeing global trends, seeing the new IPCC reports, we do see that the threats are extremely real, and they're only going to increase in the coming years. So it's really important that we, as a society, and as young people, we measure our optimism and pessimism carefully to make sure that where we're going towards is somewhere we can actually create the transformation, but also being mindful of the fact that the processes will take time and that complexity still exists, that we need to sort of slowly work towards and then ultimately create that sort of systemic, sustainable change that we all strive for.
Audrey, what's your take? Optimistic, cautiously optimistic, or not so?
I kind of agree with Swati. I mean, the fact that, recently the Singapore government announced plans for what our energy security could look like in 2050. And that report was commissioned before the war in Ukraine and energy prices spiked, but yet they still chose to release the report even while we were facing the energy crisis. So I thought that was to me, it seemed like a signal of commitment that Singapore is committed to tackling this crisis. I mean, they could have always chosen to release the report at a later date after prices have stabilized, but the fact that they still chose to release it when we were all suffering from energy price spikes, to me, I think that seems like a commitment from the Singapore government. But of course, global climate change requires the effort of more than one country. And I think the pessimism comes when you read international news and how other countries are delaying shutting their coal plants and so on. So I think we really have to see what happens in the future. But yeah, cautiously optimistic is a good word.
And David, you've written extensively about this.
I'm in the cautiously optimistic camp as well.
Okay.
I mean, we saw the energy price spikes even before Ukraine, but Ukraine, of course, has made things a lot worse. But I think it's also, it depends on the country. It's also refocused or forced countries to focus on their longer term sort of energy security. So in the US, for example, Joe Biden is coming under criticism for sort of letting go for some of his climate policies by allowing drilling on federal lands. Because he has the political imperative ahead of the midterms to bring down petrol prices, which have spiked. Plus, he's also committed to supplying gas to Europe as well. Europe has also got scrambling for gas, and that's also competing with Asia for gas as well. But Europe simultaneously is also trying to figure out how it can ramp up green energy, improve energy efficiency, and so forth. So I think this current crisis will also benefit hydrogen, particularly green hydrogen made from renewable energy as the main energy feedstock. That was very expensive. Technology is coming down for the electrolyzers that sort of split the hydrogen. Suddenly the costs are becoming much more competitive, much faster than people realized. So it's a very sort of mixed picture. I think the bottom line is there's going to be a much faster transition, I think, to green energy in some places where there's money to do it. The danger is developing countries which don't have the resources or had resources drained from the pandemic, many of these countries are still heavily reliant on fossil fuels. They may miss out on the much needed green transition. So that could still mean quite high emissions, because the developing countries still have the highest share of greenhouse gas emissions. So they need the financing, they need the support. That's really where one of the critical things that have to change.
One of the ADB reports that I saw while preparing for this program said that the climate crisis will be tackled or the battle will be won or lost in Asia Pacific. And that's the point you're making, right, of what's happening around us. And so let's come back to that in a minute. But I want to sort of draw in our studio audience, because we have people who've joined us, some Straits Times readers and subscribers. Thank you for joining us today. And we'd like to draw you into this conversation as well. And let me throw open for the first question from the floor. Ken, I think you wanted to ask a question. Please go ahead.
Yes, Ken Hicksom's our name. I do ABC Carbon Express, and I'm in as a sustainability consultant, so the topic interests me greatly. But and I know you've already referred to the impact of the war in Europe, but I'm wondering if this is really affecting energy supplies in Asia, and whether it's slowing down or speeding up the transition to renewables. We're hearing a lot and seeing a lot, and a lot of talk perhaps, but are we seeing any genuine progress towards investing at a faster pace in renewables in Asia, and specifically in Singapore?
David, you want to have a go?
Again, a mixed picture. Depends on the country. Audrey and I, in fact, looked at this quite recently. The current crisis is having quite a big impact on LNG. LNG is becoming a major source of supply for countries, particularly in Northeast Asia, but also for emerging Asia, so including Vietnam, Bangladesh, Pakistan. The problem is that some of these countries are being squeezed out because the LNG prices have gone up 1,000%. And if you're Bangladesh or Pakistan, how can you afford these cargoes on the spot market, which are tremendously expensive? Singapore, yes, is looking at much more carefully its energy options. Renewable energy in solar is one, but there are limitations to that. Green hydrogen is definitely a possibility. Importing renewable energy from Riau or even Northern Australia is another. But Singapore has the resources, the funding to do that. Are we seeing a change in transition, say, for Indonesia or Philippines? their take-up of renewables is, again, mixed. Indonesia is very much behind the curve on solar and wind. Philippines is a little bit better. I think ASEAN is a little bit slower to sort of react. I think they'll wait and see. There's a question of costs. Renewables are generally much cheaper now, but there's a lot of momentum or inertia still around fossil fuels. So, cut a long story short, certainly for emerging Asia and certainly for most of ASEAN, you won't see a major transition or a major speed up just yet.
David, I think in the piece that you wrote, you made the point about countries switching away from coal to natural gas. But natural gas, although it's cleaner than coal, is also a fossil fuel.
Yeah.
And once you put the plants and the shipment processes in place, those stay in the system for quite some time and may therefore delay the transition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How much of a concern is that we are having to switch out of less clean fossil fuels to other fossil fuels because there's this growing demand?
So natural gas, and particularly LNG, is a problem. There's an industry narrative that's been going on for many years. LNG is a good transition fuel. So we go from dirty coal to cleaner gas to renewables. But the problem I think most of us know about LNG is that it's not as green or less polluting as people think it is, because often the extraction process, say from coal seam gas wells or others, involves the release of a lot of methane simply through leakage. Also, the energy needed to chill the LNG to ship it overseas is also quite intense as well. So, and as you say, LNG will then also locks in this infrastructure for decades, and who pays for it, right? So if you're on long-term contracts, some of these contracts are quite onerous. You can't just decide not to take delivery. And if you're on the spot market, well, as you've seen, you're at the whim of whipsawing, prices. So, when you're dealing with energy security, I think countries in this region should look at much greater options. LNG, I don't think is going to go away anytime soon, but maybe countries should not invest quite so much. Maybe they also need to start also looking at greener or cleaner alternatives that will eventually phase out, certainly phase out coal, certainly phase out gas, perhaps a little bit faster than planned.
I mean, that's a good point to explore the other alternatives. I mean, Dr. Nian, maybe you could tell us about some of the other options. I see a question from one of our subscribers, Audrey Wong, about nuclear. In 2012, we looked at nuclear and we said, let's not go there. But recently, we're actually thinking about it. So what happened in that period to change our thinking about the possibility of nuclear being an option?
Yeah. Well, 2012, when we look at the pre-feasibility study of nuclear energy, we were looking at the conventional large nuclear reactors. People generally associate that with a large cooling tower, and that is something probably that's spewing out radiations, even when it's normal operation, when it's not the case, right? And I could say, if I could say that we were at the fringe of really making a move into nuclear energy in the time of 2010, 2011, before Fukushima, because, as a country, small country, we don't have any natural resources. We're buying from our neighbors, and we're always subject to these geopolitical uncertainties, fossil fuel volatilities. And so at the time, we were thinking if we were to decarbonize, meeting our climate pledge, addressing energy security and also affordability, because at that time, the large-size nuclear reactor was deemed economical when if you look at the cost of electricity over the long term. So we were thinking that's the way to go. Until Fukushima came, and then the thinking is, well, if the Japanese couldn't make it work, can we, Singapore, as a newcomer country, make it work? And if that's not the case, and if large reactors are just inherently difficult to control, then that is not the option for us. But Singapore never closed its door to nuclear energy after that. We keep an eye on what is happening worldwide, what are the technology development, who is proposing what in a nutshell. And until a few years ago, or actually, maybe a bit longer than that, we start seeing these new generations of, or rather new technologies of nuclear reactors that can be made safe. they can be made, they're what we call passive safety. So without doing anything, they will not explode, they will not have the kind of Fukushima effect as you would normally imagine. And some of it comes with kind of inherent safety. I mean, without going to the specificity of the reactor designs and engineering, these reactors can be made safe and can be made small enough, in the case of a small modular reactors, that can be placed very close to, for example, industrial users, right, so that they can tap onto the high temperature heat for chemical processing, like our companies on Jurong Island, maybe water desalination, and in today's context, maybe also producing hydrogen. So if that technology is going to be made available by 2025, 2030, maybe earlier, then we as a country looking to diversify our energy and our fuel supply, looking to decarbonize the country, maybe going towards net zero, then that is the technology that we really need to start looking at.
So the scale has been reduced in terms of size, and the safety has improved. So both aspects. But what about others? You've talked about geothermal, and in a recent report, there was a study to be done about geothermal. How likely is that to be a source for us?
I'll pass one to Audrey, because I think I'm not sure what Singapore's geothermal resources are. I didn't think they were that great.
Yeah, so initially geothermal was never considered a major source of energy for our country, but EMA, the Energy Market Authority, has done studies which shows that we have natural geothermal resources in the north where the Sembawang hot springs are, and on Pulau Tekong. So yesterday, on Wednesday, EMA issued a request for more information on the feasibility for us to tap that as a resource. But I mean, I just wanted to add on to what Dr. Nian said about nuclear. This whole energy price spike and all that, he told me when I was doing the previous story that other than accelerating the energy transition from the perspective of the government, it could make people more willing to accept previously controversial sources of energy, such as nuclear. So I think communication about those kind of alternatives and improvements in safety has to start now. If Singapore were to tap small proportion of nuclear, I think the report said 10% by 2050. Yeah.
I was watching how that story played the day we ran it, and it was one of our best read stories. And the next day we put it on the front page of the newspaper, and it was also one of the best read stories. So said to me that people were very interested in this subject, partly probably because they're concerned about how safe is this, and if it's improving, I think it will take some time for people to get their minds around it. What's your sense? Are people ready for nuclear energy in Singapore?
Well, it's a little difficult to take authority for it and to speak on behalf of everybody. But I will say something that at least at the youth NGOs at COP, and something, a recurring narrative that we come across, specifically when we talk about things like, for example, nuclear or even green hydrogen, is that there's a lot of concern on missing the boat, in the sense that we look at energy systems from this very narrow specific lens of carbon. And I think that is something that a lot of advocacy groups and young people are really concerned about, because energy systems could be vessels for a wider change, for the systemic change that we need. And we need to be inclusive of, not just accounting for the carbon that enters our atmosphere in that, very specific tonnage or kgs, but also look at, the wider ecosystem implications. What is the biodiversity relationship of, different energy systems? And then also beyond that, looking at the social aspects. People often say the S is silent in ESG, and that's for a reason, because, accounting for social impacts of energy systems can get overlooked really easily. So for us, I think, it's extremely important that we don't let go of this opportunity where we can create more robust systems of accountability when we measure for alternatives of energy, for example. But then also, I understand it makes it complex, but it also makes it robust. And I don't know whether the best option would be to choose an alternative that in the future comes to harm us in a very different way. So I just want to share that's something we feel quite strongly about, I think, in the youth advocacy groups, at least, about energy systems.
Okay. Question from the audience? If not, let me take up a point that David was making earlier about the cost of alternatives, and compared to the existing sources. It's tipping in favor of the alternatives. Are you seeing that happen more as the energy spikes increase, and will that continue as sources come on stream? And
it was certainly the case before Ukraine. I mean, there are, as Victor said, the cost of renewable energy has increased because the components have increased because of supply chain issues, and also simply sheer demand for the production of solar panels and wind turbines, and particularly for batteries. So there are certain supply chain crunch points. Those will be sort of worked out. So I think we ran a story recently saying, I think in the US and Europe, renewable energy costs or power prices have gone up by about 30%. But gas prices, of course, have gone up considerably more. So if you looked at the situation before the Ukraine crisis, India is a good example. Solar power prices were much, much less than coal-fired power generation, and that was proven repeatedly through the auctions that they do. Much more competitive. So that is helping finally sort of boost solar energy take-up. China, of course, is by far the largest renewable energy investor in the world and has plans to invest even more. The reason they do that is twofold. One is obviously they don't want to be reliant on fossil fuels forever. There's also the climate question, there's also the pollution question, which goes to the social aspect. It's also energy security as well. This is a good way for China to eventually meet a lot of its energy needs more cheaply, rather than relying on the ongoing cost of fossil fuels, which is the biggest problem with fossil fuels, apart from the climate question, is the input costs are always there, whereas sunshine and wind, of course, are not. They're free. So at the moment, I would say renewable energy is, in most cases, is still cheaper. Renewable energy and battery storage is still more expensive, but batteries are coming down in costs all the time. I think that the case is just too compelling for renewables, which is why the amount that's being invested every year has been increasing. So much so that I think solar and wind now comprise 10% of the global energy or power production, power generation, which is a dramatic increase in the past decade. But that needs to really have an impact on the climate, that needs to dramatically increase this decade again.
Let's take up the issue of solar, which is the main source of renewables in Singapore. I mean, that's the one resource we seem to have in abundance. Audrey, you've written a lot about this. Tell us, what do you see as the prospect for solar energy becoming more of a part of our mix?
I think, so Singapore's target is by 2030 to ramp up our solar so that it will by then produce maximum 3 to 4% of our total energy demand. So it will still be a really small fraction, which is why Singapore is looking to so many other alternative sources like hydrogen and nuclear. But that being said, there's a lot of interesting developments on solar in Singapore that could be replicable, could be done elsewhere as well. So for instance, floating solar panels on our water surfaces, both fresh water in our reservoirs and also in the marine environment. Increasingly, we have modular solar panels. So JTC, our industrial developer, has this solar land program where if you have a vacant plot of land, I'm going to just put out some foldable solar panels to soak up as much sunshine. So solar, there's a lot of interesting innovations here, but in the long term, I think there's really a limit to how much sunshine we can harness. Intermittency is one. We have a lot of sunshine, but we also have a lot of rain clouds and cloud formations. Our highly urbanized environment means there's a lot of shading. If you put panels on your rooftop, but some other building next door is casting a shadow on your panels, that will reduce the amount of sunshine that you can tap. But energy sources are one thing, but energy demand is also another. So recently, there's also a huge number of announcements on district cooling systems that can reduce energy consumption, and I think there are 3 upcoming, right? Jurong Lake Gardens, Tengah, and Tampines, the first brownfield site. So that could help reduce the energy demand as well. So yeah, in terms of energy security, I think other than supply, there's also the demand option that we have to consider.
Conservation, basically, which is a message we've been drumming into people for the longest time. I see a question from the audience. I'd like to draw in your thoughts as well. Please go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Cheryl. I'm from LNG Alliance. And my question is, do you think that green energy is just a new currency for trading and will become an easy commodity at this point in time? So also, just to add on to that question, where some countries who are behind the green target are still selling green energy. Thank you.
Like to have a stab at that?
Yeah, interesting question. Well, the world is never an equal place. That goes with fossil fuel. That also goes with renewable energies. Certain places are blessed with more renewable energies. Even in our region, you can find the Mekong River has a lot of hydro resources. And Indonesia, Malaysia has a lot of bioenergy, for example. And in countries where they have large piece of land, that's where renewable energy will shine. But because of this unequal distribution of renewable energy resources, the question is how do we collectively benefit from the decentralized, distributed resources, for example, as a region, right? So we're talking about this Trans-ASEAN power grid, which hopefully will bring all the electricity together, all the green electricity together, and we share the benefit. And then here comes 2 or maybe 3 challenges. First of all, who's responsible if there's a blackout or if there's system issues? Second thing, what is the price of that electricity that everybody should pay along the Trans-ASEAN power grid? Within the country, in multiple regions, for example, China or in Europe, where you have multiple provinces or states, you are still under one jurisdiction. Where in Southeast Asian context, you are across multiple jurisdictions, multiple countries, whose electricity market framework are all very different. Some are liberalized like ours, some are regulated. Some countries, if you have to stretch it a bit further, have subsidies on fossil fuel, right? And everything goes onto that grid. In the end, what is the price and cost of electricity that everybody is paying? And the last one also is, well, the goodwill is the infrastructure will be well maintained. Somebody will maintain it, right? If it's in the nice, it's in everybody collaborate or cooperate. And the question is, what does it take for everybody along the power line to cooperate, always on a goodwill basis, and to make sure there will be no disruption of electricity? And of course, in hindsight, it's all good if the electricity is flowing. But what one fine day, there is a snap, right? Power doesn't flow. And the power happens to be 2 gigawatt in capacity. Our demand today is about 6, 7 gigawatt. That means we're gonna have a black hole. And what happens? There's gonna be a blackout in Singapore. And who gets hit first? Companies on Jurong Island, the data centers, and probably, if it's the middle of night, our air conditioners, right? So they're all very realistic questions about having collective regional framework working together to tap into these renewable resources. And then coming to your second part, the countries who are less blessed with renewable energy are exporting renewable energy resources for good reason, right? They also try to decarbonize, but economic development is also a priority. So to balance those two, in the hands of the national government, which one comes first, right? So I don't think there is really a golden answer or a silver bullet to that solutions. But really, if you look at what a country can do within its territory and look at a regional approach, then I think if we were to go into the directions where the ASEAN energy outlook is pointing to, where the global world energy outlook is pointing to, and where we are looking at in terms of renewable development, then the region has to work together. Right? And how easy, how difficult, I think is a question that needs to be answered.
I think that need to work together and collaborate is dependent on a lot of trust and security in the region, right? I mean, we are trying to build up this energy grid. Audrey, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how far down the road we are with that. But if you look at what's happened in Europe, where they were relying on Russian gas as a cleaner alternative and not wanting to use nuclear, and now this massive disruption and putting energy security back on the agenda, it does show the dilemma we're in with this whole issue. And in the recent EMA scenarios, we talked about multi-layers to the grid, right? Tell us a little bit about the thinking behind that, what's put that on the agenda.
Yeah, so maybe building on that question, there was one particular scenario that assumed the world remains fragmented. So they couldn't come together and regional grids were slow to develop. So if you see what Singapore is doing now is they have established bilateral partnerships. So we have signed MOUs or agreements with companies as far as Australia, with Sun Cable, and there are talks about building a very, very long subsea cable to import solar energy from Darwin, Australia. At the same time, we have signed partnerships with Indonesia to perhaps import solar energy from there. So if one door closes, recently we heard Malaysia say that they will not supply clean energy to Singapore, there will be other doors that remain open. But if all the doors shut, our window will be other options, for instance, green hydrogen that is generated from renewable sources. There will be one option for us. Nuclear, another, maximizing solar. So yeah, the regional grid one, it can be quite challenging in a geopolitically fragmented world, which is why I thought the report was very interesting, because it accounted for all these various scenarios.
So it's about having diversity of sources to hedge your bets and make the system robust, I guess.
It's like what we do for food, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So we produce 10% of our own food now, less than 10%, so we import from 170 countries or something. Same for water. We have 4 different national taps, and recently, just to show how clean our treated used water, new water is, PUB made beer out of it. So I think that really shows that Singapore's strategy as a small country that has to import everything, diversification is key for everything, water, food, even energy too.
I won't ask you whether you drank the beer or not.
I did. I wrote about it, so I can say.
Yeah, but I wanted to take up this idea of the 3 scenarios, right? I mean, one more optimistic, and then the middle level, and the third one, which we've talked about, where there is this joint between countries and security. I'd like to get each of your views. Where do you stand on those 3 scenarios? Are you cautiously optimistic, mid-level, or quite pessimistic about the longer term? Starting with you, Audrey. Which of the scenarios did you gravitate to?
I will have to agree with Dr. Nian, because when I was writing the previous energy scenario, I asked him that. And he said that it seems that in the near future, the geopolitically fragmented world seems like, par for the course, and I agree with it looking at the situation now. But yeah, I mean, that's what I think for the near future, but hopefully once, we get over this hump, things will improve and innovation will pay off.
David?
Well, I would like to take the optimistic scenario, because I think the world is becoming just too fragmented, and things typically go in cycles. So things go bad, and then people realize they have to cooperate. And particularly with energy security, high prices, inflation, climate disasters, everything sort of piling on top of one another, I think eventually there'll be, no pun intended, a little light bulb that'll go off in people's heads, and they say, right, we've got to get together, and because we have the technology, and there is more emerging energy technology coming up, as the IPCC has just made clear in their latest report. We have the tools, they're emerging tools. I'll take the optimistic road and say that we'll get cooperation, we'll get the technology, and Singapore will have its multiple sort of branches, if you like, accessing the different types of clean and green energy.
Swati?
Yeah, I think I have to agree with David here. I think the idea that we diversify energy sources while also supporting the technologies that are going to bring in the new age of energy independence and decarbonized energy, that really is the scenario I think we can hope for. And I think seeing how at COP27, for example, at COP26, for example, we had so much agreement, and we actually didn't mobilize so much geopolitical support for things like the carbon markets, and also to some extent climate finance. I think there is a pathway there is a way to do it, and as a global community, we do recognize climate change as an existential crisis. So looking at that and how important partnerships are and how strong the intention for Singapore government to create them are, I would like to believe that we have this sort of perfect balance between technology, but then also regional cooperation that leads to like more robust systems of partnership for other aspects of sustainability as well.
Dr. Nian, which scenario did you go for?
Well, I probably is going to take a very unique view out of these 3 scenarios. Although you might still say I'm overly realistic in thinking that this world is going to be fragmented. But the way I see going forward is going to be this dynamic fragmentation where every country has to have a last line of defense, right? So you can hope for the best, the region will work together, the world will work together. But we always ask this question, but if things didn't work out, can we still defend ourselves, right? So if you have that last line of defense, be it renewable, be it nuclear, hydrogen, or even fossil fuel for that matter, right? Then you're secure in this sense, right? This is what we talk about, energy security. No matter what happens, you don't lose your energy supply, and your electricity price hopefully won't spike up too much when something happens. But turn the table around and think about a fragmented world. Is it because the way we think about energy system as it is today? Is it because the way the fossil energy industry is set up, or is it because that the way we think of renewable deployment is like that? Right? If you look at it around and start thinking from a socio-technical approach, where society takes a part and technology plays a greater role than just producing energy. For example, industrial development from, well, I'm a fan of nuclear energy, so I'm going to say nuclear energy, right? The advanced nuclear technologies, they can enable other things. For example, hydrogen productions, for example, water desalination, and for example, powering green chemicals, right? So that is actually an industry cluster on its own, right? So in the region, maybe fragmented on the energy front, the electricity front, the region might still collaborate on the industrialization front, where there's still cooperations, right? We still may not like each other when we come to electricity, but we work together on hydrogen market, for example, on, even if it's district cooling, right? Or maybe for other trade, around this industry. So I think that is probably, the most realistic future, going forward.
In a sense, I guess, with scenarios, when I was working with Shell, we did scenarios, and the scenarios weren't predictions about the future. It was just alternative futures which you prepared for. So whatever played out, you had sort of mentally thought, and that's precisely what you're saying, right? Think about the different options and prepare ourselves for that. But several of you have spoken about hydrogen, in different points in the conversation. Now, to what extent is that technology advancing so that it becomes a feasible option? Because we've been talking about hydrogen for the longest time, right? So is this a source of future energy, or is it going to be very far into the future before we get around to using hydrogen? David, you seem to have something on the tip of your tongue.
I think it's almost here. There's been so much interest in the past couple of years and investment going in, particularly in Europe. A growing number of countries now have national hydrogen strategies. Singapore's certainly looking at this as well, but certainly Germany is one of the big investors. They're pouring billions of euros into this. You have steel makers like ThyssenKrupp in Germany, which has piloted sort of a green steel, so removing basically coal or coking coal from as a feedstock to hydrogen to make lower carbon emissions steel. I think also companies in Sweden are looking at this. While we're at COP26, there's a Scottish a company that is trialling using hydrogen, so replacing using the existing natural gas pipeline process and creating green hydrogen using a wind turbine, pumping it into 300 homes that signed up to the trial, and they put in all the equipment in the houses. And eventually the whole idea is to eventually roll this out to much of Britain once most of the pipeline network is made hydrogen friendly. And that could cut Britain's emissions by some astonishing amount, because a lot of Britain's emissions, particularly during winter, come from gas heating. So if you cut that out, remove that CO2 and put in hydrogen, that will make a major change. And that could all happen in the next decade or two. It can also happen with power stations up to about 20-30%, I think, in the mix with natural gas, before we have to change some of the equipment in the actual combustors, I think. The key thing, though, is the electrolyzers. The costs of those are coming down all the time, and now you have major investors wanting to set up renewable energy zones, creating green hydrogen and green ammonia, which is the other one. I think by 2030 you'll see a lot more green hydrogen coming into the mix, and eventually green ammonia as well.
Anybody else on the panel want to add anything about hydrogen?
Maybe I can just add about hydrogen use in Singapore. So hydrogen is a clean fuel because it does not produce carbon dioxide when it's burned, unlike fossil fuels. But for hydrogen to be a truly clean fuel, it has to be generated from renewable energy sources. In Singapore right now, based on our current technology, we don't have, 20-30, 4% or 4% from solar, it's really quite small. So for us to be able to harness hydrogen in a larger way, I think one of the primary things would be for hydrogen to be imported. And for that to happen, we have to find out a way to store hydrogen safely. So I think right now in research in Singapore, there's a lot of ways going on. Maybe Dr. Nian knows better than me about how to store and how to store hydrogen in a safe way. Yeah.
Well, since I mentioned, yeah. Well, I mean, hydrogen is really a big topic, and it's a very old topic actually. We start talking about hydrogen. I think Shell was one of the first few companies that start talking about it, all the way back in the 60s, where they think hydrogen may be this is the final destination for all hydrocarbons, right? Until we realized, well, at first there was no viable production means, not cost effective enough, and then there is no demand. Right? Who's going to use that hydrogen if it's produced? If you can produce 20 million tons of hydrogen and your demand is only 20 kiloton, it doesn't work. Likewise, if you have a huge amount of vehicle fleet waiting for hydrogen and nobody can produce that green hydrogen for you, and that's also not going to work. And of course, in the value chain, there's also a lot of questions about how do you ship hydrogen over a long distance? How safe is that? And whether it's economical to do so, right? And as Audrey pointed out, when it's onshore in Singapore, well, as LNG, yes, we know how to safely handle them and store them in large tanks. Well, if that is a hydrogen tank, that is a very different circumstances. If something happens to that, then well, the entire port is flattened, right? So then the question is, well, where do we get hydrogen? Do we import? And that's the same argument about, if there's just geographical fragmentation and people are not really working together, and right now there's only a small handful of countries producing hydrogen, then it is not going to be sustainable. Can we then produce hydrogen as a country, right? Then the question is, what source do we use? Solar, we're better off using electricity rather than producing hydrogen. So what about nuclear, right? Nuclear now is on the planning horizon. If that is an energy source that can produce hydrogen or ammonia to a large amount, or sufficiently large amount, then we really think back or wind back into the 1960s, where our philosophy of having refineries on Bukong Island, in Zhurong Island, and serving the neighborhood could be replicated on the hydrogen story, where we as a country becoming a hub of hydrogen production from clean energy sources and sell to the region, right? So even if there's geographical or geopolitical fragmentation, we can still collaborate and cooperate on the front where we can become a hydrogen supplier while supplying to our own use. Yeah.
So it sounds like there is still a lot of scope for innovation and new technologies to be developed. And one of the questions I'm getting from the audience here is, what are the prospects for green jobs and investments for the future? And is that something that will open up new opportunities for people here and in our part of the world? Maybe Audrey, you could start with that. Yeah.
Other than the direct influx of jobs into the renewable energy sector, I think there's also related jobs in other sectors. So for instance, when technology still takes time to mature, Singapore might still use a carbon-intensive source of fuel like natural gas. And if Singapore wants to reach net zero emissions by a certain timeline, maybe we will need to offset our emissions with carbon credits. So that spins off job opportunities in a whole new sector of carbon services, which is growing pretty significantly here in Singapore. So there's definitely that option. And I don't know, I think David is very passionate about this topic.
David, the arrow's flying towards you.
So carbon services is rapidly growing. One of the key issues the companies are facing is reducing their emissions in some parts of their supply chains or their business practices can be relatively easy. Maybe it's a switch of fuel, maybe it's switching to electric vehicles, but there are other processes in which going that last sort of mile, if you like, of reducing emissions is quite difficult. So, and it's not a new idea, but the idea is to pay someone else to offset your emissions. So it could be investing in a forest preservation project in Indonesia, or replanting 100,000 hectares of mangroves, which take up CO2 from the atmosphere. So the idea for that is not just to give polluting companies a tick and a free pass. They also have to take action as well, other actions. So the investment around those projects and the financing them is a growing area. Actually executing those projects on the ground also takes time and money. There's also the whole process of auditing them as well. So there's as Audrey says, there's a whole ecosystem that goes around that. There's also the issue of green finance, so issuing of green bonds. Singapore's become rapidly growing quite an important area of that. I think SGX is now issues something like half of all green bonds issued in ASEAN, for example. So I think for green jobs, it would also extend clearly into the technology sector. So, ways of extracting CO2 using membrane technology. So you could still use natural gas, I guess, but you can extract the CO2 and then bury it underground. That's another thing I think that's been looked at. And Singapore's a great hub for a lot of these things. It's got the finance, it's got the technology, and it can bring in the brains to do it. So
it's technology and finance and all the related services as well that might create the jobs and opportunities.
And the key thing that is needed is the policy signals. What investors always want from a government, but also the community at large, is a sense of where we're going. What's our goal and how do we get there? I think a lot of people sort of intuitively know roughly what we need to do, how to get there, but what they need is that the policy or the regulation to sort of, it's like the landing lights on an airstrip basically. That's what policy and regulation does. It shows you which way to go and where the end is.
And Swati, when you're engaging young people about the future and green technologies, is job and opportunity something that's very much on their minds, and what do you say to them?
Yeah, I mean, as a sustainability young professional myself, I use the word young liberally, but as somebody in this sector, obviously I'm quite tuned in. Before I just jump into it, can I just quickly address something that David mentioned? Yes. And I understand that you're passionate about this, but I really have to bring up the recent IPCC report and what the role of carbon for corporate sector means. And I think one of the key statements they made is that deep emission reductions in all sectors across the board is necessary to keep 1.5 even within reach. And also within that, one of the really key learnings that was that the agriculture sector and the forest agriculture, which is all the restoration and conservation part, they will not be able to compensate for the lack of decarbonization in other sectors. Sure. And I think that sentence itself hits quite hard, because we look at this, offsetting thing as a commodity, as a future job prospect, and people want to be carbon traders. I get that, but it's really important to understand that, perhaps, like, for example, aviation or cement manufacturing, these are the only sectors which are categorized as hard to abate, which is where, emissions won't be eliminated, and therefore only in certain sectors and certain parts, maybe post 2040, you can interact with carbon markets as a way to decarbonize. But financial flows are important in that job and in that space. But I just want to say that because I'm also very passionate about the topic of carbon markets. On green jobs, I think the main thing that I've learned and I've kind of seen, I was at an event recently about measuring climate risk, and this was a person talking about insurance against certain projects and how do you measure their impact. And so they said one of the biggest things we are lacking is professionals who are multidisciplinary. So we need people who understand the environmental impact assessment aspect, how businesses interact and how policies work on it, and then how to price that in a financial market. And I think what I got from that is that green jobs need to be cross-sectoral, and they need to kind of interact with multiple disciplines. I think, traditionally we do look at jobs and sort of education in silos, but for green jobs and to really make this sector robust, I think the upcoming generation that's going to interact with these elements much more, directly. I think what is interesting and what is really exciting is that they hopefully will be, not just experts in one little aspect of the wider ecosystem, but will be able to get that kind of helicopter view of how this sustainability paradigm works. So, yeah.
Dr. Nian, your center is described as a think and do center.
So tank, yes.
There must be plenty of jobs to do.
After hearing, our panelists, I feel like maybe I should switch to agri-tech, become a botanist, right? Comparing, so that's precisely it, right? The substitutional effect of whether putting a panel on the ground or plant 2 trees, right? So I mean, of course, if I'm agri-tech, then I'll go and plant trees myself. Nature-based solution is the best. But I think what is really important in this sustainability issue is, Swati pointed out, you need to look at it in a holistic manner. Same thing with jobs, and same thing with future education and training, right? Yes, educational are silos. I mean, we have a good reason for it. If you're a mechanical engineer, you need to be really good and sharp in mechanical engineering, making sure the car runs, making sure the building are built in structural integrity. That is what we need. But in sustainability, you quickly realize that if you just so dive into it, then you're really diving into a small porthole of fossil fuel, you're in the internal combustion engine of cars, right? So then that lies the question, is that a problem with education, or is the problem with the industry, or is the problem with the way the society is being set up so that people are recognized for what they're doing as a profession like that, right? So of course, for sustainability officers and people working in sustainability field, you need this multidisciplinary kind of approach. You learn a bit about social science, you learn a bit about technology, you learn a bit about policy, politics, and energy by and large. So you know when you're in a large corporation like Shell, Equinor, you can make the right decisions in sustainability. So you don't go and just buy offset. It's easier, right? You just buy the offset and somebody into Africa is going to plant a whole bunch of trees for me. Right? But you could make the decisions to say, well, maybe let's go towards hydrogen, or maybe let's go towards more efficient refinery, plant integration, etc. But then it all comes down to then look at the plant again. What are the specific skill sets that we need in that facility that would enable this sustainability or net zero journey? I think that is really the key for the future green jobs. I think that's where, for us to think about, okay, if policy is in this direction, that the end goal is net zero, right? Or need zero physical emissions, then we need so many jobs in solar PV implementations. We need so many jobs in R&D, research and development, into battery technology, into fuel cells, into super efficient hydrogen turbines, maybe nuclear. And then on the other side, on the services sectors and maintenance, what are the skill sets that we need in that? So holistically, you form a complete value chain or supply chain, so that you don't go into a situation where, well, you have highly trained people in one cluster, but they still cannot find a job because the demand in the other sectors are not growing and there's no jobs in the other sectors supporting your job. So that is where policy, industry, and also, of course, us in the think tank need to work together to really bring a holistic approach for the green job creation.
Okay, thank you. We're coming to the close. Can I just check if there's a final question you want to put to the panel from anyone in the audience? Please do, yeah.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Nian. I work with a company called Seaborg, a clean tech company. So we've talked a lot about how to handle a crisis, but there's also this saying, never waste a good crisis. So I would like to ask the panel, where do you see the biggest opportunity for a country like Singapore in this going forward? Thank you.
Where's the biggest opportunity? Why don't we start this way? And then
Right, okay. Well, where I think I see the biggest opportunity for Singapore is the advantage of our education, right? Almost all Singaporeans are educated with a technical degree, with a polytechnic degree, with a university degree. Many of us have a master's and PhDs, right? So that forms a rich talent pool where we can make a difference in this clean energy technology industry, right? So for example, if really we are looking at nuclear energy in the future and we are serious about it, Generation 4 technologies, advanced technologies are still in the development. So we as a newcomer country, what can we do? Can we ramp up our R&D capabilities so that we catch up this wave in the future? Maybe we can become one of those leading innovators in those areas. In hydrogen, can we then train up the right skill sets and pool of people so that we can also have this hydrogen hub, supplying to the region, right? And I think really that is where I think the golden opportunity lies, with a country that is educated and is willing to challenge new thinkings and try out and be open to new options. So I think really going forward, that is where we might even be seeing new industries being established. Right? I don't know what that could be. It could be data center, could be hydrogen, could be nuclear. But
it's to be the hub for these new possibilities.
Yes, and you need the supporting.
Swati?
Yeah. I think one really interesting aspect is financial flows. And I think financial flows are going to sit at the center of this transition that we are expecting to see in this region. Singapore being the way it is and being how strategically it is placed in that ecosystem, and the relationship between developed and developing countries, and how in this international agreement we will see hopefully more investment in the region. I think Singapore plays a very critical role in that. And then utilizing that kind of existing infrastructure, existing talent that exists, that's in Singapore, and then leveraging it to make a robust systems of capital distribution, and also making it increasing accessibility of those finances. I think those are really important. And I think even in the Singapore Green Plan, that's one of the aspects that is highlighted, and I think it's something that naturally Singapore is going to excel at if they look at it in the right lens.
Anything to add, Audrey or David?
So yes, never waste a good crisis. So I think what has happened is this is not just externally, but internally. It's really forced Singapore, the government and industries, to really think about the future in terms of energy security, in terms of options that are available, in terms of innovation and education as to basically where things are really likely to go. So the EMA report is a great way to think about the future. I think with this current crisis is, if it does anything really positive, it is to force people to think, which way are things likely to head, what are our options, and how can we seize those opportunities, which would be in terms of finance, technology, education, and really turning Singapore into that central sort of hub role.
So for me, I think the biggest opportunity for Singapore will be to show the world that you can have a net zero target and have an action plan to back it up. Right now, in global climate change discourse, we have seen so many net zero targets from countries and companies. Not many of them have action plans. But I must say, so far, I mean, when the Singapore Green Plan was first launched last year, I didn't think much of it, right? To me, it just seemed like a compilation of existing sustainability initiatives. But over the past year and a half, you can really see a huge change in the way climate change has been treated, even though we are facing COVID, even though we are facing a global energy crisis. For example, since we're talking about energy comprises 40% of our total emissions. If we can bring this down to net zero by 2050, which the report said was reasonable for us to do so, that would really reduce a lot of our emissions and put us in a closer position to achieve our national net zero target. The other lion's share will be industrial emissions. We recently heard during the budget that our carbon tax is going to go up to a level that many people were taken by surprise. I mean, when the budget announcement was made, a carbon trader messaged me and was like, wow. So I think all these really shows that, you know, Singapore is committed to tackling climate change, and while we were late in the game in announcing our net zero by or around mid-century target, we had all our ducks in a row now. So I think that is an opportunity to show the world that Singapore, despite our constraints, despite our dependence on imports for energy, water and food, we still can overcome these constraints through technology, through our financial flows, through greater societal understanding of the changes that are needed.
So the power of an example for everybody else to see that it is possible to make a stab at tackling the
action
problems.
plans are like, don't just make a net zero target, have an action plan to show for it.
I saw a hand at the back, a young lady. Maybe I'll just give you a quick question before we wrap up.
The opportunity. So I actually just wanted to touch on Swati's point because I was going to ask about access to finance. I just wanted to ask about the tipping point because, you know, we have a lot of high net worth individuals in Singapore as well as philanthropy organizations, and we want to get them to sort of not say be the plug, but also be an active player in terms of addressing existing infrastructure gaps, especially in the developing markets in the region. So I wanted to ask about, you know, how can we make them more involved? What would be the thing that will, you know, attract them in order to be able to tell them that, hey, you investor, you'll be able to gain from such sustainable finance products, even despite these volatile economic conditions.
Swati,
Thank you.
That's for you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the answer really lies in what we value in the financial markets today. Some of the things we look for are, you know, hard economic returns. We look at stability. We look at metrics that are sometimes quite divorced from the environmental, social aspect. So I think one of the most important things when we look at sustainable finance, which is to increase accessibility to, you know, organizations to do projects which have returns which are not purely, you know, monetary, but they also have returns in, for example, environmental conservation or social upliftment or social mobilization even. I think the basis of this is to kind of redefine these products, these financial products. I am not a financial expert, so I will not comment too much on what those products could look like. But we are quite aware already that the way the green bonds and some of the existing mechanisms in the market are formed, they account for those non-quantifiables. And to have a much more stronger and stricter way to measure those, I think will encourage that kind of investment. And quite often, I think one thing to think about is in the developmental context, the intention of investment does not necessarily have to be aligned with the traditional intention of investment. You're investing not just for the benefit of, you want returns, but for example, if you're a company, you would invest in your supplies in Cambodia because that gives you a long-term return, or you also meet your environmental and social KPIs. So there is quite a lot of ways to convince either financial institutions or companies to look at developing countries and look at the projects in them beyond just monetary returns, and to look at it from the lens of a wider benefit they can create because they exist in those markets. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, well, we need to wrap up. So today being Earth Day, I'm going to give each of you 3 wishes. Very briefly, what would you like to see happen, and what would your top 3 priorities be to actually help us tackle the challenges we face? We'll start with you, Dr. Nian. Yeah.
Well, what are the 3 big wishes? I think the first one really is achieving a sustainable energy industry, right? Away from fossil energy, but with the right choices. My second big wish is, this is, probably I'm stealing from Swati.
It's okay, you can share wishes.
To have the right educational system where we will train the skill sets rather than training. I don't want to use the word, but really training the right form of skill sets that will future-proof our industry and future-proof the people themselves. And the last one, of course, clean air. That was my biggest wish, to have clean air, not just carbon-free, but pollution-free, blue sky.
Okay.
I think the rule is to ask for 1,000 more wishes. So I'm sorry, I have to say it. But I think number one, one of the most sort of important ones is we keep 1.5 degree target as something we all live by and we are aligned to, and not just the target as Audrey mentioned, but also have that sort of intermittent targets or goals and pathways forward, and that's for every country. So that would be wish number one. I think the second would be to kind of, through this crisis, create and explore the opportunities that can exist in the future world where we have nature-based solutions, where our relationship with our natural environment improves in a way that we make it part of our decision-making, and that becomes something that benefits us and enriches our life. I think that's number two. And number three, it has to be that we kind of create a system and world and educate people in a way where all of these are fundamentally part of how we function and how we can get the young people who are going to come and face the worst of the climate crisis. They really are going to witness, coral reef depletion and all of those things, to give them the strength and the skills so that they can come out of it the other end and restore the systems that will help the generations after them.
David.
Yeah. I guess my number one wish would be countries and businesses that make targets or pledges for 2030 and net zero targets for 2050, flesh them out. Have clear, definable goals or roadmaps as to how to get there. And these are all enshrined both in national legislation and company reports. And all the company directors are held to account if they don't meet those metrics, because that's the only way you're going to get there. There's far too many net zero targets and far too many that are wishy-washy. We have no idea how they're going to achieve that. Second would be, to steal one of Swati's, nature. There's a climate crisis, but there's also a simultaneous biodiversity crisis. So getting nature basically in the boardroom, where nature becomes integrated as part of any risk assessment. Companies are actively measured and rated against how their practices both either harm or benefit nature, and they're encouraged to therefore weed out damaging practices such as deforestation or pollution and actually enact practices that are nature friendly, because those policies can also then benefit the climate. So it's actually triple benefit if it also benefits nature on the ground and people. And the third, I guess, would be an end to any mining and fossil fuel lobbying, stealing or the ears of government. Basically rules that ban these people from capturing the political interests of so many governments. That's probably more impossible for number 3, but that's something I would dearly love to see, having seen the mining and fossil fuel lobby capture the government of Australia, if I can say that.
Audrey, you get the last word.
Thanks for leaving me to the end so that I have time to think. My first wish would be greater transparency and more consultation when governments and companies make their climate change targets. Especially, I think, for Singapore, I think there's greater desire among youths and all that to be involved in Singapore's crafting of our long-term climate change strategy, so that's one. Secondly, I also wish for greater awareness that climate change is not just an environmental problem, that people recognize that when we talk about rising sea levels and harsher typhoons, there are really people whose lives are really being upended all the time. It's just that maybe not all of them make it to the front pages. And lastly, my last wish is very domestic, that I wish people here will recycle more and recycle right. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm sure you'll be writing a lot more about that, Audrey, with such great passion as well. Well, unfortunately, as you know, time is the most non-renewable of resource on the planet, and we have run out of our time. So I hope you found our discussion interesting as we tackle this triple challenge, how to provide our societies with the energy that they need, how to do that affordably, while also safeguarding our planet for the future. My colleagues from the Straits Times will continue to keep a close watch on all of these issues, and you can stay connected with our content on the straitstimes.com, on our website and apps, and of course on our Green Pulse podcast, which I encourage you to follow. So please follow us and subscribe to our social media channels on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. I'm Warren Fernandez, and thank you once again for joining us today on our Earth Day Roundtable. See you again soon.